Hi, everybody. What a lovely hello. How's everyone doing this evening? But seriously, how are you doing? All right. I love it. Your enthusiasm is fantastic. The subject of this book is quite dark, so it's only going to get worse from here. So, thank you, all of you, for being here. Those of you who are in the room, those of you who are watching online. I think we have a lot of live stream viewers with us this evening, which is fantastic, and a very full room, which we love to see. My name's Aidan Flax-Clark. I work here at the library. I put together Live from NYPL. So just couldn't be happier to introduce Sasha Issenberg and Maggie Haberman, who are here to talk about Sasha's fascinating and not a little bit terrifying new book, The Lie Detectives, in search of a playbook for winning elections in the disinformation age, which is a completely untimely book that couldn't matter less to the moment we find ourselves in, I'm very sorry to tell you. We don't normally shout out publishers at events like this, but Sasha's book is part of a very excellent series called Columbia Global Reports that I just want to shout out because I love it. Every year they commission a small number of books from a really impressive and surprising range of journalists who report on stories from all over the world, and they just deliver you things that you wouldn't imagine seeing in books. And the best part is that they're very tiny. They're like 200 pages, so they're long enough to go in depth, but they're not so long that, it doesn't take more than a few hours to read it. And you'll find books like Sasha's, a book about why flying is so miserable, youth culture in Egypt, literature in China. It's kind of all over the map, and every one I've read has been totally fascinating. And it also calls to mind an award that I want to shout out here at the library because Sasha's book and all of the Columbia Global Report books highlight the kind of in-depth and substantive reporting that we honor every year here at the library with the Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism. And we just announced the finalists for this year a few weeks ago. And the Bernstein Award recognizes books written by working journalists that raise awareness about current events or issues of global or national significance. And winners have included Jane Mayer, Masha Gessen, Catherine Boo, and I believe, in fact, the founder of Columbia Global Reports, Nicholas Lemon. I think we are in our 37th year of the Helen Bernstein Award, so I really encourage you to go check out the finalists. You can go to nypl.org/Bernstein, read about the 5 books, and in May we'll be announcing the winner. Now, can I ask everyone for a small favor? Is that all right? Okay. I heard one yes, so I'm taking that everyone said yes. So you probably heard that last November, the mayor delivered libraries the biggest budget cut that we had received in well over a decade. It forced us to end 7-day service across the city, and it also reduced collections, programming, and maintenance at our branches. Now, the FY25 budget proposes an additional $53.8 million in cuts to the city's libraries, all of the cities. It's terrible. This would result to most libraries being only open 5 days a week, which I think is a crime, plus indefinitely delaying the reopenings of renovated branches, many of which are in historically marginalized communities, and even further reductions of spending on library materials, programming, and building upkeep. I don't need to tell you here why it's crucial to keep libraries open, right? For all New Yorkers, to continue providing free and open access to knowledge and the many vital services that we offer. But we do apparently need to remind the mayor. And this is where I am going to ask your help. In your programs, there's a QR code. You can scan it, please do. It will take you to a page where you can sign a note telling the mayor and the city council that you oppose this new proposed cut and to restore funding for libraries. If you are watching online, you can go to investinlibraries.org. Your voices really matter, and your support really means a lot to us, so thank you if you take the time. We have a lot of great lives coming up. Next week, we have a couple of people you might have heard of, Justice Stephen Breyer, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They're kind of up-and-comers, new to the scene. Both are sold out, but you can watch them online, so please do. In April, we will have Greek translator Emily Wilson, and further down the road, we'll have novelist Colm Toybin, Jamaica Kincaid and Carol Walker, Michael Stipe, and a whole lot more. So please go to nypl.org/live to sign up. Everything is free, so please come. We'd love to see you there. If you came in the room, you saw some note cards on your seats. Those are for asking questions. I promise you after this conversation, you're going to have a million questions. So write your questions down. Some of my colleagues will come by and take them from you, and we will make sure that they get up to Sasha and Maggie, and they will answer as many as they can. If you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat or email publicprograms@nypl.org. All right, Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and most importantly, by everybody here. So thank you for the support. Thank you for being here. Please join me in welcoming Maggie Haberman and Sasha Issenberg.
Good evening. It's very bright out there, so if I'm staring wide-eyed at you, that's why. Thank you all for being here tonight. A couple of disclosure notes. Sasha is a very old and dear friend. Sasha's mother is an even older and dearer friend because she was, by sheer coincidence, one of my college professors. And we are in a building as we are talking about libraries and the need to save libraries during tough budgetary times that my late father-in-law was very involved in saving. So just adding all of that in the interest of transparency as we go forward. So about, what was it, 13 years ago that Victory Lab came out?
2012, so as long as there's no math involved, that's, yeah.
You're gonna check me as we go. Sasha's book, The Victory Lab, is famous among political operatives. It was the only book I remember hearing Trump campaign operatives in 2016 read.
A famously literate bunch.
About politics. Anyway, it was a massive undertaking. It was a massive end result. Lie Detectives, much lighter volume, read it in an afternoon. But you suggest at the beginning of the Lie Detectives that it was an outgrowth of the Victory Lab in a lot of ways, not a final point, but a continuation of. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the impetus was for writing the book?
Yeah, so that book was about basically a decade's worth of innovation that had taken place and sort of transformed campaigns in ways that were largely invisible to voters. Lots of data that had become available that campaigns are using to profile the electorate, and the use of these experiments that for the first time really gave campaigns the ability to assess what worked and what didn't. And it was a largely happy story about innovation in campaigns. You know, these insights were being used to become more efficient at registering and turning out voters. Campaigns having more information about the ability to profile voters made them more likely to tailor their communications to things that people were actually interested in. And that book dealt very little with the internet, but it was of a piece with a certain optimism at the time about how the internet was making politics more inclusive. Obviously, that was a lot of the story we told ourselves after the 2008 Obama campaign, was that the internet opened up all sorts of new avenues to civic participation. I think that the Victory Lab, my manuscript, went to the printer the month that the Arab Spring started, and a lot of the story we told there was about how social media in particular had lowered barriers to entry for individuals to participate in politics, right? The sort of like canonical story was that one guy in Cairo tweeted, "Come down to Tahrir Square," and he didn't control a radio station or a newspaper, but he could start a social movement because the internet sort of opened up an ability to begin a mass movement without any of that infrastructure. And you know, what happened after the years that followed was I had reason to sort of wonder how naive I had been in that. And
how naive were you in that?
Well, you know, I begin the book in part with the story of covering the Trump campaign. My colleague at Bloomberg at the time, Josh Green, and I spent several days in San Antonio, where Trump's digital operation was based for some stories we wrote for Businessweek. And we quoted a senior Trump campaign official talking about several this is the official's words, voter suppression efforts that they had underway. And this person talked in some detail about how the campaign was using these Facebook dark posts to target, according to certain demographic and geographic ways, sort of narrow sectors of the electorate that they thought that they could basically convince not to cast a ballot for Hillary Clinton, not to vote at all. And it was the first time that I had encountered, I'd written a whole lot about people who were using high-tech tools and innovation in campaigns. It was the first time I had encountered somebody who was speaking that language, sort of modern, mechanically advanced campaigning, to talk about something that you could say is anti-democratic. In this case, trying to drive people away from casting a ballot. And I think in the years since, we've seen not only that, but a lot of efforts to use the internet in particular to mislead, confuse, obfuscate when it comes to facts, and to, in certain ways, drive people out of the process or question the legitimacy of the democratic process. And what was true of the story we tell of the Arab Spring is true on the other side, which is, yes, the lowering the barriers to entry creates all sorts of opportunities for people to come into the process, and sometimes that's good, but it means that you don't need to have a radio station or a newspaper to communicate with the public, and it has meant that there are a lot of people who have decided to use that for ill.
I'm going to come back to that specifically and the path you walk in the book, this is not a Trump conversation, but he's an unavoidable topic in all of our politics now in your book, but also for that 2016 point, because I remember that story very well that you and Josh Green wrote, where that Bloomberg senior official said that. And what was striking...
Trump senior official. Bloomberg was the publisher. Yes, whatever.
It's been a really
We've lived under many autocrats.
It's been a really long day.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was the wrong campaign. What I remember being struck by was sort of the openness with which they were talking about it. And I think that the 2016 campaign in particular brought about a change in our politics in the US that was much more openly negative, openly nasty, openly suppressive, as you say. And you're very clear about that in the book. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of importing of politics that had been seen in foreign countries into the U.S. in that election cycle?
Yeah, and
and you get into that a lot.
Yeah, about that quote, I would just say, I think two things were happening with that in particular. One was that a lot of the Trump people were basically entirely new to electoral politics, and they didn't actually know the words that you're supposed to say or not say to describe certain things. And so I think the person said
really important
without
point.
an idea that this is provocative, that there have been Justice Department investigations for voter suppression. I don't think that. The other part of it, though, is obviously Trump himself has sent a signal that certain standards, norms, practices are of no concern to him, and that he's happy to consciously violate some expectations about how politics and government works. I think it was sort of in that instance both of those were happening. What happens after 2016 is, obviously, as is probably true for everyone here, everyone is shocked by the outcome, and I sort of focus on some major decision makers within, on the American left who are thrashing about to understand how Trump wins, right? And there's all the stuff we talk about, like white working class voters, blah, 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 economic anxiety, but one major line of inquiry focuses on all the things that had sort of happened on the internet over the course of 2016 that did not get recognized, understood, contextualized at the time. And you have this moment where senior figures at the Democratic National Committee, at the AFL-CIO, major donors, are all asking, these are people who've been in politics for decades, and there's just a whole new vocabulary of stuff that they're learning about that they had not been part of how you think about political communication. So they're saying, what do we need to know about bots? What do we need to know about trolls? What do we need to know about foreign hack and dump operations? This just wasn't the vocabulary. And so they all sort of find their way to this woman, Jory Craig, who is the main character of my book. She's 25 years old at the time. She was raised in Illinois, a Model UN nerd who ends up, after college, getting a job at a political consulting firm in Washington that happens to have a large international practice. It's Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner, the founding partner. Stan Greenberg had been Nelson Mandela and Tony Blair's pollster, and so they end up
And Bill Clinton.
but they end up doing stuff on every continent. And so she's 22 or whatever and getting sent off. Her first thing is she gets sent to Moldova, and she's helping a parliamentary leader get on Facebook for the first time. And she works in Gabon, and she works in the Philippines and in Bahamas. And in early 2017, all these people end up coming to her because these things which seem novel in our politics, if you step back just a little, are actually not that novel in politics. So foreign interference, I think we were all taken aback by the idea that a foreign government's intelligence service would be spending money to try to move votes. You can go almost anywhere on earth, and the idea that a foreign government or a foreign business interest would actively take a role for a variety of reasons trying to influence an election, like totally standard, has been for a long time. The role that rumor and conspiracy theory have played. There are large swaths of the world where people accept that rumor is just a sort of standard vector by which political influence and information moves. I think for us now, this era of like partisan and ideologically motivated media is something that's difficult to get our heads around. There was a lot of it in the 19th century. It almost entirely was marginalized in the 20th century in America. If you look at almost every one of our peer countries, the media environment is dominated by news organizations that make editorial choices very unapologetically to advance a certain cause. And she had worked in places where candidates, parties had to make political decisions accepting that this was like how the world worked. And so she had a sense of context and perspective that was incredibly important when American political campaigns decided we need to think about how to integrate kind of counter disinformation work into the campaigns we're running.
And what did that look like? As she comes back to the U.S., she is becomes sort of incorporated into Democratic efforts. What were her tasks when she?
Yeah, so she basically becomes like the first dedicated full-time counter disinformation operative in American campaigns. This wasn't a job description that had existed before 2017, 2018. And the overarching project is deciding what do you respond to, when, and how. And the political communicators had a pretty good shorthand developed through, that was all sort of attached to the organs of 20th century communication. So, if there's a bad story about you on page 1 of the newspaper, you have some idea how you'd respond, but if it's stuck on page 19, maybe we don't do this right away. If, this talk radio station does something, maybe we need to push back on it, but if this thing doesn't, here's where it makes sense to come out and do a press conference. Here's where we might just want to quietly try to get the editorial page to call the other person a liar. Like, this was never written down, but you talk to the people who ran campaigns, and this is sort of, they understood how to navigate each of these things. Nobody knew how to translate that to the sort of new world of online lies. And so part of what her job was to help them develop the data to separate the things that are worth a response and not worth a response, to help political communicators who'd been trained in a kind of 20th century media mentality around broadcast television, radio, print. Fundamentally, it's not just a difference between online and offline. I think it's a difference between centralized and decentralized media, right? And so the big challenge that campaigns faced was the asymmetry of this new environment. And as those barriers to entry had lowered, it meant that the person who was talking about you online, maybe truthfully, maybe untruthfully, but they weren't necessarily your opponent. It wasn't another candidate or another party. It could be a foreign state actor. It could be somebody who's just putting content online to make money off of it. There was some great coverage in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election about a town in Macedonia where a bunch of teenagers had figured out that they could create basically fake US political content, sell ad clicks against it, and the stuff that got the most clicks was the stuff that was most provocative and often based in mistruths. They didn't care whether Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump won. They just had sort of figured out how to game the online advertising economy. Or like people, you know, in their basements who maybe support a candidate but aren't part of the official campaign, or maybe they just want to create mayhem or chaos and have fun online. Now a campaign had to deal with all these questions about when and how do you respond to people who are talking about you online who are not operating under the same constraints you are, and for whom getting chastised by an editorial in the newspaper is of no consequence whatsoever.
Have you seen anything, I want to come back to the specifics of the case studies you look at in the book in a second, but have you seen anything that has replaced, look, the expression working the refs is often used about the media. It's in cases like what you were just talking about, which is there's a system and candidates react to coverage. I would argue that Donald Trump helped smash that too, but he was not in isolation. It was happening long before him. Is there anything that has replaced that system, or is that just basically gone? So is it just the Wild West?
So the refs, such as they are, still exist, but they're weaker, right? I mean, media institutions of every kind are that have any broad credibility are you know.
The trust is eroded.
The trust is eroded, right? And so I think campaigns still care about, you know, whether it's the New York Times or you know, the San Antonio Express News, that getting the newspaper to validate that your opponent lied or exaggerated or misled is still worth something. Campaigns still like the idea of, I want to get some independent, PolitiFact said you lie. Right. They like putting that in ads. Right. But I think that and they still care about having fact checks, because there is something to be said in the internet economy for, if the Associated Press runs a fact check, then when people Google, you know, did Joe Biden kill a hobo, they'll get a fact check instead of finding something that says that Joe Biden killed a hobo. He did not kill a hobo, as best we know.
Thanks.
Yeah. So there's people are interested in it, but they recognize there's a lot less value there. And I think a lot of it is because politicians, and Trump is a good example of that, are far less worried about being called a liar than they want. That what used to be, and used to be like, we're talking 10 years ago, right. 15 years ago.
Not that long ago.
Not that long ago, right? Politicians lived in fear of being called a liar, and so there'd be all, but now I think that a lot of the, and that was not because they were worried that voters would maybe look less favorably upon them, but there were also a bunch of other incentives that I think Trump has defied, which is like, if you're a legislator and you are known as a liar, maybe your colleagues are like a little less interested in working with you on a bill, right? Your donors maybe are a little less enthusiastic about raising a lot of money for somebody who is seen as a liar. Maybe interest groups that don't want to endorse somebody if they think it's going to reflect poorly on them. And so there are all these sort of incentives that align politicians to not want to be identified as having, which is why, like, let's be clear, politicians have always shaded the truth. Some have lied, have exaggerated. Let's not pretend like before 2016 we were in some wonderful era where our political communication was existed on some remarkably high plane, right? But there was the joke was always that politicians would, shade the truth or cherry pick statistics or whatever, because being brazenly distruthful came with all these costs. And I think two things have happened in the year since. One, a lot of politicians, and once again, Trump is sort of the exemplar of this, but I think particularly within his party, the costs of being associated have gone down. And at the same time, you have all of these people who are communicating online who are not political institutions, right? The foreign governments, the Macedonian teens, the people in their basement having fun. Like, they don't have colleagues, donors, interest groups, a public reputation. And so they exist entirely out of, and it's not worth anything for Hillary Clinton's campaign to say, like, those Macedonian kids lied. Let's get the editorial page to scold them.
Yes, and on the internet, everything looks flat and the same on social media. So in this new incentive system, Alabama becomes a crucible that you write about. And again, you have a couple of case studies throughout the book. Talk a bit about Alabama and specifically what happened when Reid Hoffman, a Democratic donor who I'm sure many in this room have heard of, got involved in the Senate race to replace Jeff Sessions.
Yeah, so just to take people back, because it's been, 2017 was like 40 years ago.
At least.
In Trump years. Jeff Sessions joins the administration. There's a special election to fill his seat. You may remember Roy Moore was a Republican nominee. It's the first real election after Trump's victory. And so folks on the left are using this as the first sort of proving ground for all of their new hunches and theories about how we, do things anew. And so there are lots of little bits of innovation in all sorts of ways, including two separate projects done by one sort of led by an Alabama progressive activist, the other led by a sort of cluster of Democratic technologists, including some who had been involved in Barack Obama's administration and campaigns, to create disinformation that would drive voters away from Roy Moore. And at this point, the menu of what a Democratic counter-disinformation or what a Democratic approach to communicating in this disinformation age would look like was totally open. Like, everything was on the menu. And so we talked about Jory Craig. She comes into the process, and she's emphasizing monitoring and tracking and sort of coming up with communications responses. But there end up being people who are talking about maybe we should sort of embrace the coarse, caustic, jokey language of the internet and push back on stuff in that vernacular. You have these efforts in you have a lot of talk about regulation and a role for government, but you have these two projects in Alabama that create these separate false flag operations, one of which is to create the perception that a Russian bot network basically overnight has started following Roy Moore and supporting him online, with the idea that press coverage would make it look like Roy Moore was being supported by Russian intelligence services, I guess the way that we came to learn through the Mueller report that Trump had been. And the other, unrelated, was an activist who created a fake temperance prohibition organization called like Dry Alabama. This thing did not exist in the real world, but he developed a Facebook-based presence for it.
And it was believable, right?
It was believable. Roy Moore was
he was a teetotaler. He was a
teetotaler. He comes out of a Baptist tradition where this, there's a lot of history behind this. And the idea was create a real-looking fake activist group of supposed prohibitionists who wanted to ban alcohol or add to the number of dry counties in Alabama and give the perception that they expected that if Roy Moore won, it would help ban alcohol in Alabama. And the idea was to promote ads that looked like they were pro-Roy Moore, but to target them so that they would be seen by sort of moderate Republicans, the type of people who would be ambivalent about Roy Moore and presumably like their booze and would be convinced to maybe not vote for the Democrat, but vote for a third-party candidate. And these things happened. There wasn't tons of money behind them, but there was real money, six figures, spent. And it took a little while for people to understand exactly what had gone on. But about a year later, both the New York Times and the Washington Post put together investigative reports on sort of each of these undertakings. And it turned out that both had received money from Reid Hoffman, who's one of the founders of LinkedIn and a venture capitalist who, especially after 2016, had emerged as one of the major donors on the American left. And Hoffman and his top political advisor, this guy Dimitri Melhorn, had mounted a very high-minded critique of Donald Trump as a threat to democracy and spoke in sort of grand, sweeping terms about what the threat to truth. And these news stories and the commentary around them, quite reasonably pointed out the hypocrisy of this, which is that you are using exactly the same types of methods that you are claiming are illiberal when Donald Trump did them. And very quickly, Reid Hoffman puts out a statement that sort of says, I don't want my money going to stuff like this. And it's not a terribly precise statement about what is disinformation or not, but it is sweeping. And almost overnight, this open conversation that Democrats have been having about, hey, should we be making disinformation too, get short-circuited because just about everybody in Democratic politics at this point is either getting money from Reid Hoffman or wants to get money from Reid Hoffman. And he has had one bad PR day about this and decides, I'm going to set a sort of moral boundary around what I think is right. And amazingly, we're now 5.5 years later, it is mostly held. You know, like there have not been examples that I'm familiar with of sort of large-scale disinformation efforts digital disinformation efforts on the left. I think one of the open questions this year is, as we get to November, if it seems like there's a high likelihood that Donald Trump will win, maybe not with Reid Hoffman's money, but I would be shocked if there are not folks on the left who sort of, you know, one thing that you will find now, and I found while reporting this, you find all sorts of Democratic operatives who say, why aren't we fighting fire with fire?
Right.
Why are we, you know?
Which has been said by Democratic operatives for 2 decades now, ever
Yes.
since the Swift Boat campaign,
Right,
which you write about as well.
Yeah, and you know, I wanted to get to the bottom of, like, why hasn't there been? And I really think that the power of sort of Reid Hoffman's central place and the way that this played out then has had that power. I find it hard to believe that sort of accepted prohibition would stand all year if people think that would be something that would stop Donald Trump from returning to the White House.
Do you think that if that does happen, this is a tricky question to answer. This is less about disinformation and just more about your observation of the U.S. political scene over a very long period of time. But the U.S. is very much in the ends justify the means approach, certainly on the political right. We hear this all the time from Donald Trump and his supporters that, you know, the Democrats are an existential threat to the country. They're going, you know, the country can't survive is something that Trump says at his rallies over and over. That's a perspective that holds on the left too. It's quite open. What does that portend for the future? If it doesn't portend, you know, if there's an open question as to whether there will be, you know, Reid Hoffman-like tactics used this year, and that was going to be one of my questions to you, where else can this go?
So I think that, you know, broadly speaking, I think there are folks on the left who are conflicted about this, you know, who, and not specifically about this disinformation, but about the ends means thing, and it is a big ongoing source of tension around people who fund political activity of all kinds on the left as to what extent, you know, in the fight against what they might describe as autocracy or totalitarianism, they should be upholding kind of a procedural liberalism to do that, or whether, you know, this conversation is overlays the fact that it has become easier, largely because the tech companies have ceded a lot of the responsibility or ability that they had to moderate content. It has become easier to disseminate that disinformation at scale now than it was even 5 years ago, probably. Right. And so there are fewer, to use a phrase that we hear a lot, guardrails these days outside of whatever the choice of the political actors have about what they think is proper. There are probably fewer constraints or limitations coming that would stop them. An
adjacent point is one you make in the book about how big tech has become a whipping post for both parties. Looking at this TikTok fight in particular, and this legislation that Donald Trump was suggesting should not be banned, his call for Republicans to stand with him did not work. Where do you see that heading in the coming months? And I'm especially struck by TikTok, which I confess I'm not great at. My oldest child gets almost all of his news from it. And it's organically a site where if you talk to people who understand TikTok, Donald Trump's supporters are much more organically active than Joe Biden's. What is the future? I don't know how much you look at TikTok, but what is the future of this discussion about big tech, moderating big tech by government, and how this might play out in the 2024 campaign.
Yeah, I mean, so the TikTok's its own case because of the foreign ownership dynamic. I do not expect there will be any regulation anytime soon, and I think a lot of the tech companies accept that, which is why efforts they made, I'm talking Facebook primarily now, but in 2018 and 19 to put on a show of we take seriously our responsibility to police content on the internet, they have backed away from entirely, and I think at that point it was in part because they saw the potential for congressional action, and they do not see that now. TikTok is a lot of the focus and the congressional debate has been on this sort of geopolitical threat. Let me talk from the perspective of people who are running campaigns.
Please.
TikTok is a challenge to them because it is even less transparent than Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, X is, or most of the other conventional social platforms. The whole thing is like an individual post does not have a link, so you cannot actually send you see something and it just goes down the river, it goes away. So a lot of the sort of tracking mechanisms, which are based on identifying solitary pieces of content, a post, a video, a photo, and then seeing how they move, you can't really do that. And two, the recommendation engine in TikTok is even less tied, it appears, to whom you follow and what you've liked. And so it is much harder for outsiders to get a handle on what is actually moving or being seen on TikTok and why. That would be true if it gets sold tomorrow to an American company that uses the existing code. That's what makes it addictive, because you can just sit back and stuff gets thrown at you, regardless of, even if you don't follow anybody. And I would add into but that sort of black box quality is really difficult for academic researchers who want to understand what's going on online, and very difficult for campaigns that want to be in a position of trying to anticipate what voters are seeing. The other set of apps I would put into that category are that we don't talk enough about. I think there's disproportionate, in this disinformation conversation, disproportionate attention paid to Facebook and Twitter. Facebook because it's like the big daddy of social media, and because the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I think, was the first time that there was a real sort of controversy about.
Can you just remind everyone what that was, the Cambridge Analytica
Cambridge
scandal?
Analytica was this London-based consulting firm that did work for Ted Cruz and Donald Trump in 2016 that was profiling voters and created fake personality quizzes to sort of hoover up Facebook users' data about their friends' networks and stuff, so that they could build what they called psychographic profiles of voters. But it opened up, when this became public, it opened, I think there was, a whole lot of concerns about privacy, about data integrity got opened up by this, and was the beginning of, if you had to crystallize the moment where Facebook went from the we're a good place for political communication to, oh no, we have to defend ourselves, when everybody started accepting that Facebook is like an evil force in American politics. I think you would trace it to that moment. The other apps, though, that I would put, and Twitter, because the media are on Twitter, and so we sort of disproportionately overreact.
Less so than
less so, but still, I think the apps that I would focus on, that we don't focus on enough, that I would be thinking about, are messaging apps. And so this would be WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, that have become a very weird hybrid of group text style messaging apps, along with kind of broadcast platforms where you have tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people that are in this closed community that is by invitation only, that is encrypted end to end, and that are especially prevalent in immigrant communities in the United States, and have in many of them supplanted traditional media or talk radio as a source of news. And I write about the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the party's House campaign arm. And now when they send a field organizer out, especially in places where there are large non-English speaking communities, to South Florida, to Orange County, California, they send the field organizer out, and it's not just find a storefront and order the pizza and bring people in and teach them how to knock on doors. The first thing that they are asked to do is go meet with people in the community and get invited to all the closed groups on WhatsApp so that we can get visibility into what voters are seeing there, because you can't just turn on the radio or look at the newspaper and get some sense of what, Vietnamese Americans in Garden Grove, California are hearing about politics today.
You and I are going to wrap up shortly, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. So I just have a couple questions I want to ask you. To that point about how the internet is now, messaging apps and so forth are now used, and social media sites are used by campaigns. You write a lot about what the Biden campaign did in 2020.
Yeah.
And it was pretty effective. They were aided in part, I would say, in that moment just by, a global moment with the pandemic that I think changed the information ecosystem somewhat. But can you talk a bit about what they did and what they learned and what that might be applicable toward this campaign cycle?
Sure. So they really wanted to, the big problem with disinformation, this sort of goes back to what Jory Craig started telling people in 2017-18, is like, people are going to be lying about you all the time on the internet. If you're a public figure, a public institution, not just a politician, people will be lying about you on the internet. Most of it is not actually a concern for you as a campaign, because a lot of the disinformation that from the perspective of the Biden campaign, a lot of people lying about Joe Biden on the internet is going to be stuff that Trump supporters make to amuse other Trump supporters and get their attention.
Right.
And that's, I guess, bad for democracy. It may hurt Joe Biden's feelings, but it's only a problem for the campaign if it's getting in front of the relatively small share of voters who are persuadable, probably 10, maybe less than that percent of the audience.
50+1 problem is how Rob Flaherty describes it.
So Rob Flaherty was the digital director of the campaign. He's now a deputy campaign manager. He says if it's not a 50+1 problem, if it's not going to cost us a vote, we don't care about it. And so he called this identifying market-moving disinformation. And so the goal was, what is actually going to be an electoral harm for us? And so they embarked on a big research project in the summer of 2020, in which they surveyed persuadable voters, and they came up with a list of viral narratives that were circulating about Biden. Some of these were completely untrue. Some of them were grounded in some or a lot of fact, but these were things that were going to move online, not just things that Trump would put in campaign ads or whatever. And so they used a lot of Trump's own shorthands because they are actually very useful. So there was Sleepy Joe, related to his age and his mental sharpness. Creepy Joe, we don't hear a lot about this anymore. This was that Joe Biden is sort of handsy with younger women.
That one disappeared too.
Yeah, went away. Stuff related to Hunter Biden's business dealings, stuff related to Kamala Harris being either too much of a socialist or too much of a cop. They even created some fake storylines, like the idea that Joe Biden belonged to an all-white country club, which is not actually true, but to put them in the poll to get a baseline of what people would say that they had heard. And they cared about two questions. One, are you familiar with this storyline? And two, would it make you less likely to vote for Joe Biden against Donald Trump? And they mapped this on a grid, and one axis was the reach, how many persuadable voters had been exposed to this, and two, the impact, would it actually change their votes? And the idea was, we care about stuff that's only up in that upper right-hand quadrant, right? That's the stuff that is market moving, is damaging. And what they found was that a lot of people had heard about the Hunter Biden stuff. But they said it wasn't likely to affect their votes. And focus groups revealed this was because, these people didn't think that Joe Biden was fundamentally motivated by personal financial gain. So they'd heard it, but it didn't really resonate with them in a way that would change their views of him. The stuff about his age, they said would affect their views. And the focus groups revealed it wasn't because they were worried about his physical fitness. They saw Biden as a fundamentally weak political figure. I think a lot of this has to do with having been defined as being vice president, sort of stumbling into the nomination while never being the main character of that primary. And so in the summer of 2020, there were a lot of persuadable voters who didn't really know what Joe Biden believed in. As one of his pollsters said to me, they were worried he would not be the author of his presidency. They wondered about who would actually be in control and whose agenda he would be carrying out. And so the response to that, there had been this effort in the campaign's communications department to deal with the age stuff by setting up photo ops of him riding a bicycle or have him run up the stairs to his plane. And this research project revealed that that wasn't going to address voters' concerns. They weren't actually concerned the guy couldn't get his steps in every day. They were worried that they didn't actually know what he wanted to do in office. And so their response was stuff that if you saw it, you would not think it had anything to do with age. Right. They started buying digital ads that if you went on Google and searched for Biden and senile, you would get shown a 15-second video of him speaking to camera, unedited, about his economic policies and why they meant something to him. And so the way that they characterize this approach, which I think is universally useful for everybody to think about, is not to treat disinformation as a supply side problem, which is, I think, the initial instinct. There is a piece of content that is moving. It's a post, it's a deep fake video, it's a conspiracy theory, and we're gonna track it and like play whack-a-mole with whatever the thing that's moving today is. So not to think of that, and think of it instead as a demand side problem. What are the existing anxieties or concerns that voters have, in this case about Joe Biden, that makes them receptive to certain bits of disinformation, and develop your communications response not to attack the disinformation, but to attack the underlying anxiety.
Well, that speaks to, this will be my last question, and then we'll go to your questions, but there's sort of almost a level of acceptance in the futility of trying to combat the disinformation itself there, right?
Yes, and I think this, almost everything I write about in this book, the people I'm writing about feel like they have developed some effective response techniques and some effective mitigation techniques. But we started talking about my book, The Victory Lab, which was about people who define problems and set out to solve them. And we could argue about how big it is to get like 1 percentage point more effective with your direct mail. But like they felt a real sense of achievement about that they had tackled this problem and solved it. The experience of reporting this book over a year and a half was to see all of the people I was following, both in American politics, and I spent some time in Brazil before the first round of voting in 2022. Everybody over the course of the time I was with them grew more and more fatalistic about the value of the work they were doing. I think that they would tell you all sorts of little things that they had sort of figured out and taught candidates how to do, but the scale of the problem was just getting bigger and less manageable, and they felt like their contributions were the world was becoming far more hospitable for lies than it had been when they started this work.
Let me turn to questions. So this is the platform that one of my other children gets his information from. One social media platform you didn't mention is YouTube. How much influence on 2024 do you think this platform will have?
I mean, I think YouTube's another thing where there's a recommendation algorithm that people are worried about. I mean, YouTube is a place where campaigns do communicate too. So one of the trends we've seen with tech platforms is largely them pulling back from wanting to be a place. Some of them are saying we don't take political advertising. Some of them are sort of saying we're going to de-emphasize political content in our recommendation engines. YouTube is a place where campaigns can and do spend significantly on advertising. So it at least offers campaigns a place to put their, in the same way that a campaign might advertise on the evening news because that's where they're going to be talking about me. So let me get my own message out there. This is a place where Instagram campaigns can't buy ads, and so they can't sort of be part of the conversation in a paid way the way they can on YouTube.
Are people on both sides of the political divide equally susceptible to political disinformation, or is one side more susceptible than the other?
So there is some psychological research about I'm a little wary of some of it, but that certain personality traits end up leaning left and leaning right that might offer some insight into this. I would say that I think so much, there's a sort of separating cause and effect here is quite difficult. I think that the persistence of conspiracy theories on the right has both fed is both cause and effect of a weakening trust in institutions that has been encouraged by major figures on the right. And so, are people less trustful in the CDC because of COVID conspiracy theories, or did they lose trust in the public health establishment, which is why they're receptive to these things? I'm not quite sure, but I do think that there are far more signals that you are seeing from elites on the right, media, politicians, not to trust traditional institutions that had authority over what's true and false, then you see the equivalent on the left.
Can I ask a related question, though, of my own? So you're talking a lot, and you talk a lot in the book about the incentive structures that exist now in the age of disinformation and in the internet era. Is one of is there now a disincentive? And I would say this is certainly true on the political right. Is this also true on the political left, that there's less of an incentive to admit making a mistake? That
Yes.
just becomes fodder for the other side? I'm thinking specifically in terms of, go ahead, I'm sorry. I'm thinking specifically in terms of a lot of what we saw around the pandemic, for instance. And I'm just wondering if there's a disincentive, the major one being decisions made around education, for instance. Is that a disincentive at this point?
Yeah, I think some of it may be disinformation, some of it may be just how few voters on anything are persuadable, not just in the electoral context, but the way that our coalitions have sorted and polarized on things like pandemic response mean that on any given question of public interest, there are going to be far fewer minds in play that people in positions of power feel that they need to persuade or court, and proportionally a far larger need to, cater to your own coalition. And so my guess is there are just far fewer demands on political communicators to speak to people who might be ambivalent about them or whose minds are in play, because there's just we're in far less of a persuasion environment now than we had to be on almost any question of public interest 30 or 40 years ago.
This is a question for both of us, and you should take it first. Do you believe that there should be federal regulation attempts to stop disinformation? Why or why not?
It's very hard to imagine what they would look like. Part of the reason I went to Brazil is that the country has probably the most powerful election regulator. I mean, I guess if you looked at the news, Russia has a very powerful election regulator too. So, but for a democracy, for a vibrant democracy, Brazil has the Supreme Electoral Court that has basically gobbled up power and serves as not only a version of our Federal Election Commission writing rules about election processes, but has basically appointed itself an arbiter of truth in any sort of political communication. And the Chief Justice of this court, since the 2018 election in Brazil, has developed a degree of authority that is astonishing. And so he can order takedown requests of content on any tech platform in Brazil and issue major fines if Facebook doesn't take down a post within the hour, is not accountable to anybody, has had people jailed for spreading content online. And it is, I spent a lot of time in Brazil with people who are on the broad center and left of Brazilian politics, and they have been very happy with the outcomes that they have had having a very powerful election regulator, and that played a significant role not only preventing Bolsonaro from coming back to power in 2022, but in investigating, prosecuting, and punishing the folks who attacked government institutions in Brasilia during the transfer of power. And because they've been happy with the outcomes, they are not that interested in publicly criticizing the process, but it is probably this court has done more to be a savior of liberal democracy in Brazil, and has done so with some incredibly illiberal, undemocratic processes that I don't think we would be excited about having here. And I think people in Brazil probably are crossing their fingers that these powers do not end up in the hands of a party of a different partisan orientation, because they would. This is a country that has a recent history of dictatorship. I think they're very attuned to some of this. But it sent me home with a sense that this is very difficult work, because the challenge of the internet is this works in Brazil because you have one government authority that can order something taken down immediately without any due process, appeals, public review, challenges. Which is what you have to do online, because stuff moves so quickly that if you had a process where even if tomorrow, there was a hearing, stuff would move and you take it down in 2 days, it doesn't really matter. And so I came away, not with a great vision that there was a way to do this effectively that would align with our ideas about the First Amendment and otherwise.
Who has innovated in data campaigning more since 2016, the Democrats or the Trump campaign?
I think Trump has. I think if you talk about data, Trump's the big shift in this is less data campaigning than use of the internet. Right. Trump's big breakthrough, which came entirely from his sense of like so many things as you've written about, Maggie, instinct and intuition, was to break the kind of command and control logic of the traditional political campaign, right? The way political campaigns have worked historically is we spend a lot of money on research, on policy research, on issue research, on opinion research, and then we refine down to the word exactly what we want to be talking about and how, and do our best to put it in front of the share of voters that we think want to hear it. And the whole campaign operation is based on the idea of being able to do that at scale and stay, quote unquote, on message, right? Which is why when, you go and volunteer for a campaign, they say, great, thanks for coming, here's a clipboard, now here's exactly the script you read. Because you're not telling your supporters, hey, go to, whoever you want to talk to on your block and just start chatting with them about abortion. It's like we spent thousands, millions of dollars trying to define exactly what we're going to say about abortion. We're not going to let our craziest supporters run wild with it. And that's why when the internet came along, most campaigns saw it in this very transactional way, which is we will use the internet, we can reach people in a cheap way, and we will use it to ask them to do things, to give us money and maybe to volunteer. But we will not ask our supporters, hey, communicate on our behalf on the internet, because it totally defies the logic of sort of message control. Trump, because he's Trump, just started, retweeting, amplifying some of the craziest things that his supporters said, because he liked it, because it was amusing, because it pissed off the right people, whatever it was. And Trump sent a message to his supporters that hey, you could communicate on behalf of this campaign. I value that. I will amplify it. I will spread it. And I think that's part of the reason why Trump has created such a vital community among his supporters online, the folks who call themselves MAGA and have organized in all different corners of the internet, because he empowered them to say hey, the things you want to say about politics matter and are a useful contribution to the campaign. Barack Obama has a massive contact list. Right. He never asked people, or never sent a signal, hey, I'm going to elevate your voices. It was going to be, I was going to ask you for things and you'll do them. And so that is an incredibly, Trump stumbled into understanding the internet better than anybody in Democratic politics, and I think some of the most important innovation that's happening in Democratic politics is figuring out how to empower supporters and trust them, to relinquish some of the trust and empower them to communicate on the campaign's behalf, and that's a place where Democrats are very much playing catch up.
He also, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but he completely changed the way Republicans do online fundraising and small dollar fundraising, and a lot of that is because he had treated himself as a commercial property for as long as he had, which is a different aspect that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, he has an entirely different relationship with supporters online, and a lot of what I think Democrats have been doing online was largely trying to migrate things that worked offline online, and Trump, a lot of this just from his instinct and then building a campaign apparatus around his instincts.
We have time for one last question. You've talked a little bit about this, but I'm curious what the more granular answer is. Much emphasis has been placed on local elections, even down to the school board level. How does disinformation factor in at that level, and/or how can organizers manage and battle social media?
Okay, so I'll send everybody home with the thing that should give you nightmares.
Good, because I was going to ask you what makes you optimistic, and apparently it's nothing, so good.
No, so I came away from the time I was working on this book, I'll say sort of two things. One, I came away less convinced that disinformation was going to be a problem for any one particular campaign, especially a presidential campaign. And I think part of that is there are so few voters that are in play in so few states that it's very difficult to move their minds on anything. And I think that there's this sort of fallacy that that many of us have had in the last 8 years, and media coverage contributes to this, that's sort of like the magical disinformation fallacy, I would call it, which is people who are skeptical of political communication when it comes on TV ads or in direct mail and goes like, that stuff's not gonna change my opinion. Like, well, all these ads over, then there's like, oh, but it was on the internet, and it's like, oh my God, this is gonna sway the election. And I think we should bring the same level of skepticism to, the idea that any one tweet, whether it's true or false or viral narrative, is going to, we know how difficult it is to move people's opinions in this environment and keep them moved. And I grew convinced over the time working on this that the idea that, that Joe Biden's campaign is gonna get sunk by like one deep fake or something, which I think is sort of the fear that maybe comes through now in like all of this AI related panic about stuff. I think that's probably oversold. I did come away probably more concerned with the threat that disinformation poses to democracy or society, with the lack of a shared set of facts on public policy questions, which is not just about elections, but about the ability to govern, about the ability to have any sort of consensus about things. I think that that's and that has a lot to do with just the weakening of institutions and trust. But where I would be concerned about the ability of a particular bit of disinformation to affect electoral outcome, not at the presidential level, maybe not at the level of a big city mayor's race or a big statewide election where voters are getting tens of millions of dollars is being spent. Voters have strong opinions about the politicians involved, but would be as you get down ballot, where voters don't know much about the candidates. They're not necessarily getting a lot of information. Maybe that one viral rumor about, so-and-so beat his wife or whatever could actually move a lot of opinions. And this is where the tech companies are even less prepared, even if they wanted to be prepared, which most of them don't. They couldn't be. I was talking with somebody who was telling me Facebook is just still trying to get a list of every candidate for every office that's having an election this year, which, to be fair, is actually a really difficult problem, right? But they have set up systems and processes for fact-checking and content moderation, training individuals on the big stuff that we know about, right? Like, is Joe Biden senile? Like, Facebook knows what they'll do, and they've trained algorithms and stuff. They know how they're gonna handle the Joe Biden senile. If there's something that comes up about somebody running for county commissioner in Nevada, they have no tech that's been trained to identify that problem. They probably don't even know the name of that candidate. None of their staff have ever, don't have a place to start on this. And the people on Joe Biden's campaign or Donald Trump's campaign or the Democratic National Committee, they know how to get somebody at Facebook on the phone within 10 minutes to draw attention to something if it's a problem. They might have to fight over whether Facebook does anything, but they know how to get the attention of people. That person running for county commissioner in Nevada doesn't know what to do the moment they hear that there's a rumor moving around about them online. And it's the type of thing where, if 2 or 3 days later they finally get somebody to look at their content moderation requests, then it's going to be too late. And that, I think, is the big, if you're going to have a worry this year about disinformation disrupting an election, it should be in an election that you're probably not thinking about right now.
Thank you all so much for being here. Sasha, thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
Please read the book. It's fantastic.